When you think about the Hundred Years' War, a few huge battles probably pop into your head, right? Crécy, Poitiers, Agincourt. They're legendary. But today, we're going to talk about a campaign that's often just a footnote. King Edward III's invasion of Brittany in 1342. Now on paper, this thing was a total mess. We're talking logistical nightmares, horrible winter weather, and it all just kind of fizzled out into a tense standoff. And yet, what if that was the whole point?
That's the big question we're digging into. This isn't just a story about armies and sieges, it's a deep dive into pure strategy. We're going to see how a campaign that completely failed to achieve its main military goal actually turned out to be one of Edward III's smartest and most important victories.
So here's how we're going to break it all down. We'll start with the crisis that kicked everything off in Brittany, then we'll follow England's first few moves and the king's own huge gamble. We'll get stuck in the mud with his army during a miserable winter siege, watch a diplomatic endgame that nobody saw coming, and then finally, we'll connect the dots and see how Edward won the war without ever fighting that final battle.
All right, so where does this all start? Well, like a lot of medieval conflicts, it begins with a death. In 1341, the Duke of Brittany, John III, died without a clear heir. This created a massive power vacuum in a really strategic spot. See, Brittany was technically loyal to France, but it was also fiercely independent. And with its long coastline and key ports, it was the perfect launchpad for an English invasion. So suddenly, this critical piece on the chessboard was totally up for grabs.
And two guys immediately jumped in to claim the prize. First, you've got John of Montfort, the late Duke's half-brother. He pretty quickly got the backing of King Edward III of England. Then you have Charles of Blois. He was married to the Duke's niece, and, this is the important part, he was the nephew of the French king, Philip VI. So with France backing its guy and England backing theirs, this local fight blew up. Just like that, the Breton Civil War became a proxy war, a brand new theater in the Hundred Years' War.
And in the beginning, it wasn't even close. The French side was absolutely steamrolling the opposition. Charles of Blois was a pretty good commander, and his army just swept across eastern Brittany. He even managed to capture his rival, John of Montfort, and had him tossed in a prison in Paris. The whole Montfort cause looked like it was toast. John's wife, Joanna of Flanders, was cornered with her young son in the far west. It really seemed like the whole thing was over before it even began.
But Joanna of Flanders was not someone who gave up easily. She was actually known as Fiery Joanna, and she really lived up to the name. She took command of what was left of their army, rallied her supporters, and sent a desperate message to England for help. Now, Edward III responded, but not with some huge invasion force. Instead, he started small, with a few targeted strikes.
And what England sent at first was shockingly effective. In May, a tiny force led by this daredevil knight, Sir Walter Manny, showed up and broke the siege of Hennebont, which is where Joanna herself was holed up. Then, in August, a small English fleet with maybe 1,350 men arrived at the critical port of Brest just as it was about to fall. They smashed the French naval blockade, and the sight of English ships was enough to make the much larger French army on land just pack up and leave. And to top it all off, at the end of September, the small Anglo-Breton army met the French at Morlaix, and, even though they were way outnumbered, they won a huge defensive victory. These little wins completely turned things around and bought them precious time.
Okay, so with his allies pulled back from the brink, Edward III decided it was time to go all in. He was going to lead a major army to Brittany himself and finish this. But right from the get-go, this grand plan was a total gamble, and his biggest enemy wasn't the French army. It was something much more mundane: logistics.
The plan was big. Edward wanted to land in Brittany with 6,000 men. For the time, that was a really significant army. This was supposed to be the knockout punch. It would secure Brittany for his ally, give England a permanent base on the continent, and open up a new front that would take the pressure off his other territories down in Gascony. But, as he was about to find out, planning to raise an army is one thing. Actually getting it across the sea is something else entirely.
It was, and I'm not exaggerating, a logistical nightmare. See, the English king didn't have his own navy. For any big invasion, he had to force private merchant ships into service. And you can imagine, the ship owners hated this. They knew they'd get paid late, if they got paid at all, and their ships could get wrecked. The admiral in charge was practically resorting to threats just to assemble a fleet. And even then, after some ships dropped off the first wave of soldiers, a bunch of the captains just sailed for home and refused to go back for a second trip.
And this right here, this moment just screams desperation. By October, the weather in the English Channel is getting really dangerous. Edward didn't have enough ships for even half his army, let alone all their gear. So he made this unbelievable decision. He ordered his entire siege train, the catapults, the trebuchets, all the heavy machinery you need to take down a fortified city, to be left behind, right there on the beach. He decided to sail with just the men he had and hope for the best.
The trip itself was a total ordeal. What should have been a quick hop across the channel turned into a 3-week nightmare. The fleet was battered by storms, horses were lost overboard, supplies were ruined. So when Edward's exhausted, depleted army finally stumbled onto the shores of Brittany on October 26th, it was already late in the year, they were seriously under strength, and they were missing their most important equipment. The Great Campaign was basically crippled before it even started.
But even after that disaster of a journey, Edward pushed forward. He gathered his forces and aimed them at the key port city of Vannes. Taking Vannes was absolutely critical. It would give him a secure base for the winter where ships could actually dock. But in doing so, he was committing his army to a winter campaign, which is one of the most miserable, difficult things you can do in medieval warfare.
The attack on Vannes was a bust, right from the start. First, they tried a surprise attack from the sea, led by a commander named Robert of Artois. Now, Artois was a French noble who had switched sides, and he was known for being super aggressive. This time, it blew up in his face. His ships were beaten back by French mercenaries, and Artois himself was fatally wounded. His death was a huge blow to morale, and worse, it tipped off the French, who rushed more soldiers into the city. So then Edward's main army, after building new siege engines from scratch, tried to storm the walls. That failed too. The English were stuck. A long, cold siege was their only option.
Now this is a key point. While the main army was stuck outside Vannes, Edward didn't just sit on his hands. He sent out his mounted knights on what were called chevauchés. These weren't just simple raids, they were a form of economic warfare. English troops would ride deep into French-held territory, not to capture it, but to burn everything they could find, villages, crops, anything of value. This put a ton of pressure on the French, and also had the nice side effect of convincing a lot of local Breton lords that maybe siding with England was the safer option.
But back at the siege, the situation was getting really grim. Edward had fewer than 5,000 men left. Soldiers' contracts were up. We know that a group of 400 crucial Welsh archers just packed their bags and went home in the middle of December. And the winter storms were so bad that no reinforcements or supplies could get across the channel from England. His army was totally isolated, shrinking by the day, and starving. Foraging in the dead of winter is a brutal, thankless task. Disease and hunger were ripping through the English camp. And just when it seemed like Edward's army was about to either freeze or starve to death, the French finally showed up. And I mean, they showed up in force. A huge army, led by the French king's own son, John, Duke of Normandy, marched into Brittany. They were fresh, they were well supplied, and there were tens of thousands of them. They marched right up to within 18 miles of the English camp. The stage was set. This was going to be it, the final decisive battle that everyone knew the English had absolutely no chance of winning.
I mean, just look at the mismatch here. It's almost comical. On one side, you've got Edward's little army of under 5,000 guys who are sick, starving, and stuck. On the other, a massive, well-fed French army that's several times larger. By any military math, the English were toast. It looked like the only options were to be completely wiped out or to surrender in total humiliation. But that is not what happened.
Instead of a huge, bloody battle, a couple of cardinals sent by the Pope showed up to negotiate. And for their own reasons, both sides were willing to talk. So on January 19, 1343, they signed something called the Truce of Malestroit. And as the historian Jonathan Sumption puts it, the terms were, quote, astonishingly favorable to the English. Seriously, from a position of what should have been total weakness, Edward somehow pulled off a diplomatic miracle. Okay, so let's break down how good this deal really was for Edward. First, the English got to keep every single fortress they had captured. That solidified their foothold. Second, Vannes, the city they failed to take, was handed over to the Pope's representatives. This basically made it a neutral city, so the French couldn't use it. Third, the French king had to release John of Montfort from prison, which was a massive political win. And finally, the truce was set to last for over 3 years. That gave England a huge amount of breathing room to regroup and plan what to do next. For an army that was on the verge of being destroyed, this wasn't a good deal, it was an unbelievable win.
And this really gets to the heart of it. The Brittany campaign of 1342 was, by all military standards, a failure. Edward didn't take his main objective, his army almost fell to pieces, and he never got his big battle. But by turning that military failure into the Truce of Malestroit, he secured a huge strategic victory that would end up changing the entire course of the war. The long-term effects were massive. The French king probably assumed the English would just go home. They didn't. They put soldiers in the fortresses they were allowed to keep, creating a permanent English military base inside Brittany. The port of Brest stayed in English hands for 30 years, which secured the sea lanes between England and their other French territories. The political momentum shifted, too. More Breton nobles started to see the English backside as the one to bet on. And most importantly, that 3-year pause gave Edward all the time he needed to plan his next, much more famous invasion of France in 1346, the one that led to the legendary victory at Crécy. This failed campaign in Brittany was the necessary setup for England's greatest military triumphs.
Edward III's forgotten campaign really teaches us something important about strategy. Victory isn't always about what you do on the battlefield. Just by surviving, by pushing through a logistical disaster in a horrible winter, and by grabbing a diplomatic opportunity when he was at his weakest, Edward turned a losing hand into a winning one. It really leaves you with a pretty interesting question. In the high-stakes game of war and power, is a well-timed truce sometimes more powerful than a sword?